I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network. A new report is shedding some more light on how special counsel Jack Smith is honing in on the intent element to the various crimes that he's investigating that Donald Trump committed, and specifically the intent element being demonstrated by testimony from many of Donald Trump's former top national security officials. And many of these former top national security officials were included in the order by the Court of Appeals in the D.C. Circuit, which recently said that Donald Trump's claim of executive privilege, trying to shield their additional testimony, or in some cases testimony in the first instance, was without merit, affirming the district court's ruling and compelling a lot of these former top national security officials to testify again before the criminal grand juries in Washington, D.C. that Jack Smith is presenting evidence to. For example, on April 4th, after that Court of Appeals order, very quickly we saw one of the top deputies at the Department of Homeland Security, Ken Cuccinelli, who was the right-hand person to Chad Wolf, who was the former acting Homeland Security Secretary. Cuccinelli was already back testifying before the grand jury after previously testifying there as well. And so specifically the intent element is being demonstrated because a lot of these individuals, according to this report by CNN, the article's called Exclusive, national security officials tell special counsel Trump was repeatedly warned he did not have the authority to seize voting machines. So this report talks about how numerous people who have testified before the grand jury, who were former top national security officials, has told the grand jury that they informed Donald Trump that he did not have the right to seize voting machines. They told him there was no evidence of foreign interference with the election that would overturn the results of the election or change votes from Trump to Biden, like all of Donald Trump's conspiracy theories, and also that there was not voter fraud in any way close to being sufficient to overthrow the results of the 2020 election, that there was absolutely no merit whatsoever to Donald Trump's claims of voter fraud tainting the results of the 2020 election. And nonetheless, despite getting that advice, despite all of Donald Trump's top national security people saying, "You're wrong, none of this took place," Donald Trump persisted to overthrow the results of the 2020 election. So that is essentially smoking gun evidence of Donald Trump's intent, which will be incredibly difficult to rebut. So some of the individuals who we are talking about who have been telling the Department of Justice this, or have been telling the criminal grand juries this, include Ken Cuccinelli, the former top deputy at the Department of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, who was the former acting Homeland Security Secretary, former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, as well as the former Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe. And Ratcliffe and Cuccinelli and Robert O'Brien were all in that federal order compelling their further testimony or additional testimony, or in some cases testimony in the first instance before the grand juries in Washington, or before the grand jury in Washington, D.C. And then the Court of Appeals from the D.C. Circuit Court affirmed that Donald Trump tried to block their testimony, asserting executive privilege. And we've talked about that concept of executive privilege here on the MeidasTouch Network. Executive privilege is where a president basically says, look, my conversations, my communications with my advisors is confidential while I execute my constitutional functions as the commander-in-chief. they have to remain confidential. And as I execute my functions generally as the president under Article 2, those powers require that those communications remain confidential. However, there are two flaws in Donald Trump's argument there. Executive privilege usually, in almost all circumstances, can only be claimed by the current executive, not the former executive. And here, President Biden has not asserted executive privilege, and President Biden's top special counsels have put forward a statement why Biden's not asserting executive privilege, because, of course, Donald Trump's conduct is not in furtherance of any duty that the president would normally engage in. In fact, Trump's conduct was to essentially overthrow our democracy. So there's absolutely no constitutional basis to protect those communications. And in addition, executive privilege claims can be defeated if there is a compelling need. And the Department of Justice has demonstrated, Special Counsel Jack Smith has demonstrated to the chief judge of the district court, the federal court in Washington, D.C., and to the Court of Appeals, of course, that the Department of Justice's investigation into what led to the January 6th insurrection, the crimes that took place on January 6th and thereafter, constitute a compelling need to override executive privilege. And they got Donald Trump's claim of executive privilege was overruled, and these individuals were required to testify.
Let's take a quick break to talk about our next partner, ZBiotics. Now, if you're like me, you've probably skipped a workout because of drinks the night before. Like, it happens. But if you're committed to your healthy routine, you need ZBiotics. ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol Probiotic is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. It's designed to work like your liver, but in your gut where you need it most. Just remember to drink ZBiotics before drinking alcohol, drink responsibly, and get a good night's sleep to feel your best tomorrow. Now, I can't lie, after we hit 1 million subscribers, I may have partied a little bit too much that night. But luckily, I knew I had ZBiotics. Now, as instructed, I drank a bottle of ZBiotics before any alcohol, and I was amazed at just how good I felt the next day. Give ZBiotics a try for yourself. Go to zbiotics.com/Meidas to get 15% off your first order when you use Meidas at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee. So if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember, head to zbiotics.com/Meidas and use the code Meidas at checkout for 15% off. Thank you, ZBiotics, for sponsoring this episode.
Like, you'll recall, for example, that there was actually executive orders that were prepared by Donald Trump's like top aides and top allies and people in his inner circle. I mean, people like Rudy Giuliani, people like Sidney Powell, people like Mike Flynn were there at that famous meeting that took place on December 18th, where you had some of the former top White House lawyers, right? People like Eric Hirschman and people like Pat Cipollone and Patrick Philbin were basically calling Sidney Powell, Mike Flynn, Giuliani. They called them Team Crazy, and they had prepared executive orders for Donald Trump to seize voting machines. And in fact, Mark Meadows had gone to, Chad Wolf, the former acting Secretary of Homeland Security, as well as to Ken Cuccinelli, essentially with these executive orders saying, can you do this? We want you to do this. And they were going to the top military officials as well and saying, Trump wants you to do this. Trump wants you to seize the voting machines. And look, people like Chad Wolf and Cuccinelli, they were very much loyalists to Donald Trump, but even they said, look, we can't do this. We don't have the authority to do this, yet Donald Trump persisted and persisted nonetheless. And they also said there is no evidence of anything that you are claiming. We want you to know that. And then there are some other people who were not like Trump loyalists, but who wanted to provide this testimony, but Trump was blocking it. People like Robert O'Brien, for example, who was on the phone line when this December 18th shouting match took place, where Sidney Powell and Giuliani and Mike Flynn wanted Trump to execute this executive order, and Trump's own lawyers were saying that you couldn't do that. And so O'Brien, of course, is going to testify before the grand jury about that. Now, one of the other points I want to make, and I think this is a very, very important point, for everybody who really wanted this to move quicker than it has, I totally understand the frustration about the speed in which this investigation has taken place, both under Merrick Garland and under Special Counsel Jack Smith. But it is actually necessary. This is how you have to prosecute crimes like this, where you have to climb the ladder. So the first level of prosecutions are the lower level insurrectionists. Then you climb it to the more violent insurrectionists. Then you get the terrorist groups, right, like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. And in respect with the Oath Keepers, there have been multiple seditious conspiracy convictions. The Department of Justice is essentially batting 1,000 in all of their jury cases, like an incredible record of getting these insurrectionists convicted. And then you kind of work your way up to the top. And then one of the things that happens, though, is that these criminal grand juries don't meet every single day. So they meet only a certain time each month. You only have a finite period of time with them. And you have to schedule and coordinate with the witnesses. First, you try to get the witnesses to show up voluntarily. If they don't show up voluntarily, then you subpoena them. They could object to the subpoena. They could show up and testify and then not answer all of the questions. And then what you have to do is you have to then go file a motion with the federal judge, get a ruling from the federal judge after briefing takes place. And the statutory briefing periods, can take some time. At this point, the federal courts are not messing around. The courts of appeals are moving this very, very quickly. But earlier on, you'd get a hearing date a few weeks out. The parties would brief it. You'd get an order shortly thereafter, and then the individuals would have to come back and testify again. So all that has taken time. And then you also have to just kind of start with certain witnesses, develop the case, then call other witnesses. Like Jack Smith has been winning these executive privilege fights, dating back to kind of a long time ago. Like Donald Trump's top former White House lawyers, like Pat Cipollone, Patrick Philbin, former Vice President Pence's top aides as well, his former general counsel, his former chief of staff. They all lost their executive privilege claims, or Donald Trump asserted the executive privilege and that was lost. And they had to go back and testify for a second day. So more testimony. And then you just kind of keep on building and building and building. And then you get these witnesses, and now you really narrowly tailor it to the elements of the crime. And then you're focused on the intent element right here with this evidence. If the case was filed super quickly, as everybody wants it to be, including myself, the risk you run is not getting the evidence. And that is incredibly problematic if you are going to do a trial without getting every piece of evidence that you need, because ultimately, yes, we all saw the crimes that took place. We're all aware. Most of them we've seen with our own eyes. But you need to make sure you have all of the evidence gathered, you have all the testimony, everybody's locked in, and that there aren't going to be surprises at the federal criminal trial when that takes place after Donald Trump is actually charged, because you see all the games and all the schemes that Donald Trump will try to pull. So you got to to dot every I, cross every T, because he's going to pull every game, every scheme you can to try to derail it. That's why, in my view, this prosecution has been handled textbook, and this evidence, this report from CNN about these former top national security officials who have been providing all of this information regarding Donald Trump's intent and mental state, which you have to show to convict him, is very, 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 critical. And that this is where Jack Smith is focused on is also, again, very, very important, and shows you how narrowly tailored this investigation is getting, how in the nooks and crannies this is getting. It's exactly where you want it to be, and that shows me that there's real progress being made. And of course, there's the other news that we reported on the MeidasTouch network, that former Vice President Pence has said he's not going to appeal the district court order where he was compelled to testify before the grand jury. And so had Jack Smith not gone through this process, not gotten the wins where there really is no chance of Pence prevailing in the Court of Appeals, then this whole prosecution, this whole investigation could be completely disorganized. It could be a mess. You wouldn't get that key information. Let me just put it this way. You would not get former Vice President Pence's testimony or any of these top national security advisor testimony if you filed that case right away, period. And I think we all agree how important it is to get this testimony locked in before criminal charges are filed and brought. Right? I think we all agree with that. That's why it's so important that the prosecution be done in this way. I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network. Thank you for watching. Hit subscribe. We're on our way to 1.5 million subscribers. Thanks to your incredible support. Help us get to 1.5 million. Also, check us out at patreon.com/MeidasTouch. That's how we fund our operations. We don't have outside investors. So check us out at patreon.com/MeidasTouch. Also, wherever you get your audio podcast, just search MeidasTouch Podcast and download it. It's free. All right, now hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. It's free to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Ben Meiselas. Until next time.
Love this video? Then you'll love the MeidasTouch podcast. Listen as my brothers and I break down the latest news and chat with top political leaders on the fastest growing pro-democracy podcast in the world. New episodes drop every Tuesday and Friday. Add the MeidasTouch podcast right now wherever you listen to your podcasts.